Hello there! In this video, I will teach you everything you need to know to master isometric illustration in Inkscape from the ground up. We'll start from the absolute basics and build up from there, learning a ton of tools and techniques, as well as some tips and workflows when making isometric graphics in Inkscape. And this is very important. While I'm gonna start from the ground up when dealing with isometric graphics, I will not be going into handling the program itself. I will assume that you know at least the basics of Inkscape. My Inkscape basics course here on the channel should be enough to understand everything in this video. There will be a link in the description. And if you really want to be fully prepared, I would also recommend you to give it a look to the basic Inkscape illustration techniques video. Link also in the description. Making this type of scripted videos takes a lot of work, so if you can spare a like and maybe some comment, it will really help me. And if you want more content on Inkscape and illustration, I upload a new video every Sunday, mostly scripted tutorials like this one. Please subscribe and hit the bell. But before we begin with the actual program stuff, very quickly I want to clarify some things about isometric illustration so we are all on the same page. When we talk about isometric graphics, we mean a particular type of perspective projection or view that some games use to make top-down graphics. Don't confuse isometric graphics with top-down graphics, though. We often refer to this very particular way of displaying graphics from a top-down view specifically as top-down graphics. This type of graphics go for this fake, inconsistent perspective that's very useful for pixel art games because it communicates clearly and is not limited by real-world sense. You can see, for example, how the front of this building is kinda seen almost from the front, and the top is almost seen completely from above. That does not make sense in real life, but it works great for a low-resolution game. Isometric graphics, on the other hand, go for an actual consistent perspective, even if it's not very realistic regarding the way real-life cameras work. And here it will be very helpful to understand the difference between axonometric and isometric perspective, especially because right away when we are creating a grid, that funny word, axonometric, will show up in Inkscape. In gaming, we often refer to axonometric perspectives as isometric. In reality, these two terms mean different things. An axonometric perspective is a perspective where the lines do not converge, often called parallel projection, and the object is shown from the sides and above. An isometric perspective is a particular type of axonometric perspective where the edges are at 30 degrees, so all axes are at the exact same angles. This small confusion isn't really a problem, but we're gonna have to make a difference because some techniques will work with isometric perspective, but not with other axonometric ones. I'll let you know when that problem shows up. Okay, so with that in mind, let's move into setting things up to work in an axonometric view. Of course, we need a grid. To set up the grid, go to File, Document Properties. Here you have to go to the Grids tab. And here on this dropdown, you'll see the option between creating a rectangular grid and an axonometric one. You already know what axonometric is, so hit the New button. Here you got quite a few options. These are very important, so let's look at them one by one. First is the origin X and Y. These options will displace the grid up and down, left and right. Not really that important unless you want to align it to an already existing illustration, maybe a screenshot that you import into Inkscape. Spacing refers to the size of the grid. Because most of the time you'll be working with the pen tool, you'll most likely want to change the size so the default size of the stroke made by the pen tool, which is 1 pixel, looks nice and noticeable. If the scale is too small, each strike will be huge. And if it's too big, each strike will be unnoticeable. You could also change the size of the pixel stroke of the pen tool in the options, but it's easier to make a quick change here. A good size that always works for me is between 20 and 30. The next option is the angle. Here is where we put to use what we saw in the previous section. This number here represents the angle between the two edges of the grid. You don't need to know the mathematics, I certainly don't. Just know that 30 in both boxes is a pure isometric view. and every other number will be another type of axonometric view. If you're interested in experimenting with other views, you can always do what I do and import a screenshot into Inkscape and try to make them fit the grid using the more geometrical objects. Here are some popular games that use axonometric views other than isometric and the settings to use in Inkscape. Pause the video if you want to check them more carefully. The other settings here are related to the grid color. If you zoom right in, you'll notice that the grid is made up of two groups of lines, one more noticeable than the other. In Inkscape, you can have two groups of lines that can have different color called the minor and major lines. Every 5 minor lines, there is one major. This is just a nice thing the program does so you can see better. You can change the color of either by clicking on these boxes and selecting the color you want. Pay attention to the alpha slider that controls the opacity. Most likely you will want the two lines to be at least a bit transparent, so you can still see your actual drawing. And of course, you definitely want the minor grid to be of a lower transparency, or maybe even a different color. I found that 5 minor lines per major line works great, as it is by default. The more lines of the same color you have, the easier it is to get a bit lost, so 5 is just right. The rest of the options are more related to working with more than one grid. You most likely won't do that, so you can skip them safely. Once that you have the grid, you still need to check up a few other options related to snapping. This time I won't go into detail, I just want to let you know what you need to get started. First of all, you have to have this button over here enabled for any snapping to happen. This button is a nice way to quickly enable and disable the snapping options that are set. Now to set those snapping options, right next to this button there is this arrow. By clicking on it, you can see very easily the different options to what you're gonna snap to. We don't care about those. Instead, click on the Advanced Mode button. And these are the same options than before, but more detailed. Now, I didn't touch anything. This is how it should be by default as the latest version of Inkscape. I want you to notice that the grids option here is disabled by default. Make sure that it's enabled. That is the only option that you want to change. If it happened to be enabled, then don't touch anything. Now, if you switch to the pen tool, you should see this little X and a message that says Handle to Grid Intersection or Handle to Grid Line. You should be able to snap at any point in the grid. Here's a very important thing you should know about snapping objects to the grid using the Object tool. Inkscape will prioritize snapping from where you grab the object. So here, notice that when I try to move the star from this corner, a little X shows up on that corner along with a message letting me know that this is the node that's gonna snap to the grid. The same happens if I try to grab it from any other node corner. It will try to snap that particular corner to the grid. This is really useful when you want to move around shapes and you absolutely need the right corner to snap to the right place. Another important setting that should be enabled by default should be this option that says Line Midpoint. This one is important because it will allow you to snap the middle point of an object to the grid, even if there is no node there. Just like before, all you have to do is to grab closer to the middle point, and you should see the blue box saying Line Midpoint to Grid Intersection. Always keep an eye on the little message and what it says. When you have a ton of objects, sometimes it's easier to snap to the wrong place and not even notice. One last thing, you can hide the grid at any time by going to View, Page Grid. It may come in handy when you want to see the whole illustration without the distraction of the grid. We'll explore a bit more of the snapping options later on. For now, that was everything we need to get started. For this first section, I want to talk about the basics that we're going to build upon. The examples I will be showing here will use a pure isometric view, but everything should work with any other axonometric view. So first of all, let's build some basic shapes. Isometric graphics, especially using vectors, rarely are too complex. Most of them are heavily geometric, so if you know how to make basic geometrical shapes, you are set to build almost anything. So starting with a simple cube, the easiest way is to grab the pen tool and guide yourself using one big square. Trapezoid in this case will be more appropriate, but you know what I mean. Then you draw the other two sides. Make sure to close them. Even if they are sharing borders, each plane should be its own closed shape, so it's easier to give it color and maybe make some adjustments later on. Using that base, you can draw other shapes that are not equal-sided, like a cubical shape that's longer or wider, or maybe even slightly more complex shapes, like this hollow rectangle. One key concept of drawing anything in isometric perspective is the concept of extruding a shape. That is, giving dimension to a simple flat shape. If you've worked in 3D programs before, you'll get immediately the concept. So the key is in thinking which plane is the most descriptive, and then extrude it, like you would in a 3D modeling application. Only that here you're using the grid and extruding manually instead of using some tool or operation. And we'll expand on this later. Once that you start feeling more confident making cubical shapes, maybe you can try with more complex ones, something with more planes. The method is the same. You start with the most descriptive side, and then you fill in the other sides. It's not hard once you know how to do it. And finally, you can start introducing shapes with angles. Again, these are not hard if you have the grid to guide yourself. Keep in mind that most of the time you'll be drawing some buildings or other simple terrain, so in a way you're always drawing some more or less complicated variation on the cube. As soon as you start making more complex shapes, it may happen to you that some part of the front or top of the object will cover one of the sides, like in this case. Here you have two options. You could just draw through, or you could adjust the shape so it looks correct. Because most of the time you'll want to add some color, in my opinion it's easier and less prone to error to just draw through. It will look right once you give it the proper color. And that's it. That's the base we're gonna build upon. It's really not that complex. Now it's just a matter of practicing combining simple objects to build other more complex objects. Before moving on to the more advanced drawing section, let's look at some basic tools and techniques that you will be using to do anything. The most important technique you need to learn is related to the concept of extruding the shapes we talked about before. If you have a complex shape that you would like to add depth to, sometimes it's better to use a duplicate as a guide to add the other sides. Once again, start by drawing the most descriptive side, and now instead of making the other planes, grab this shape and hit Ctrl D, and this will duplicate the shape in the exact same place. Then you move it to the place where you want to extrude it. And now it's much easier to build the sides. A quick detail to keep in mind: when you're extruding the shape, you'll need to remember if you're extruding it towards or away from the camera. If you're extruding it away, you'll need to send it below the stack order. Otherwise the order will look wrong when you give it color. This will apply whether you extrude a side or top plane. Also, when you give it color, one of the planes, either the duplicate or the original, usually will be buried beneath the other planes. Here you can leave it as it is, or you can find this shape and delete it. A nice little feature of the object tool is that you can select objects obscured by others by holding Alt while you move the mouse wheel. Expanding on the concept of making a guide to add the side planes, this can be really useful if you want to make a layered structure, where the top shape is different from the bottom. The simplest example will be a pyramid. First you will draw the bottom plane, and then you make the sides. The bottom plane becomes hidden below the other ones. By using that feature of the object tool, you can find it and delete it if you want. A slightly more complex example will be a cut down pyramid. The same technique applies. You first draw the top and then the bottom, and then you join them in with these inclined planes. It may take some small calculations to align the two shapes vertically in perspective. You may need to count carefully the small squares. The most common use for this technique is when you want to make some sort of complex building. In that case, you would first draw the top, and then go down making a new shape every time the contour changes. This feels a lot like building a shape using the extrude operation in a 3D modeling application. It may be a bit confusing to see all these shapes overlapping, so you may want to give them color and even go building the sides as you're extruding the shapes, so you can see what you're doing better. This last one may take some practice. The only tip I can give you is to work big. Instead of using a single big square as your size, go for 4 or more. This way you got more room to sculpt the shapes you want. And now I want to give you a tip related to that, to the size. One problem that you will encounter sooner or later is that you will want to draw something but it's either too big or too small to take advantage of the grid lines. Like for example, this house is made of 2 by 1 big squares, because the size works just fine when making it. But if I want to add some windows, I run out of squares. One nice thing to remember is that because you're working in a parallel line perspective, the object is not distorted by its size. So you can work comfortably here on the side, making a gigantic window, and when you're done, you can select everything, group it if you want, and then you shrink it down, scaling uniformly to the size you want. This is great for making small details. It is very common that you will want to distribute objects in equal distances. Continuing with the windows, here I want to align these windows all throughout the building, and I don't care for aligning them to the grid squares. This is quite unintuitive, so you may have not thought about it. But the way you do this is by aligning the shapes both vertically and horizontally. First, you should open the Align and Distribute dialog by going to Object, Align and Distribute. Then you select them all and hit this button to distribute them horizontally and this button to distribute them vertically. And it works like a charm. Okay, this next one is super important. Sometimes you need to translate an asset from one view to the opposite. A clear example will be to translate a door or window made in the front to the side. It may not be immediately obvious that by flipping the shape horizontally, you can adapt it to the opposite view. The default shortcut for the flipping command is the H for horizontal and V for vertical. Most of the time you'll be translating the shapes from one view to the other, but in some occasions you may want to translate it vertically. This operation will also work with axonometric projections that have both angles set at the same number in the grid options. But what if you want one object to fit another axis? To translate one object made in one of the side axes to the top and vice versa. In that case, you need to rotate it exactly 60 degrees. In Inkscape, you can rotate in 15-degree fixed intervals by using the rotation arrows while holding Ctrl. This will only work with an isometric view, when the two angles are set to 30 in the grid options. With the flipping shortcut and the rotation options, you can translate any form you make to any of the other axes. Before finishing with the basics, I want to talk very quickly about colors and adding believable illumination. Light and shadow is a fairly complex subject and I won't go into detail here, but if you want to pick correct colors, you'll need to know the absolute basics. When light hits a surface, it will make its color lighter. The more a surface faces the source of illumination, the more light the color will be. If a surface is not directly touched by the light, almost always will still have some degree of light hitting it because light rays bounce around other objects, though this bounced light is much weaker. In a cube-like object, this means that one of the planes will be the lightest, where the light hits more directly, which usually will be the top, because the sun is usually the main light source. And then there will be one plane that is the darkest, which is going to be opposite to the light rays of the sun. And finally, the other plane, the other side that's still somehow being directly hit by the light, but not as strongly as the top, which will have a lightness level of somewhere in between the two other planes. Of course, the sun does not always gonna be the main source of light, but for a common isometric illustration, this works fine. Okay, so how do we translate this to Inkscape? Open the Fill and Stroke dialog, and here you'll see the HSL color selection mode, which is an alternative color selection mode that separates between the three main values of a color: the hue, saturation, and lightness. The L slider controls how much light or dark a color is, so you can use it to easily define which plane is the one in light, which one is the one in shadow, and which one is the one in between. Just select all planes from the object and give it any color you like. Use the wheel. It's much easier to pick a nice color with the wheel. I like this orangey yellow. We can say this is the middle color of the building. Now go to the plane that should be in shadow and slightly move the L slider down to make it darker. You don't want to move it too much, just a bit. Now repeat the same steps for the plane that's more strongly hit by light, in this case the top plane. This time move it slightly up, again not too much. And you should see immediately how this object looks like it's solid and existing in 3D. As an easier alternative to quickly pick colors, you could use the colors here on the palette. Each hue palette goes from a dark version of the color to a light version, changing only the L slider value. So basically, it has swatches that do what we did, of lowering only the L slider, automatically. If you don't care too much about the exact colors and you want something that works quick, then just pick colors from here and don't worry about the HSL mode. Though of course it's useful to know how to do that to get more refined colors. Of course there are other ways to illuminate an isometric object that is not the classic top left setup, but they are quite less common and this setup works great. And the same with the colors. There is a lot more to picking colors than the L slider. But just like everything else on this tutorial, I can't possibly delve deep into that. I'm gonna leave that exploration to you. Like I said previously, most of the isometric illustrations that you'll be doing in a vector program will be simple and geometrical. Even if you're going for a more organic scene, it will usually be stylized to be quite geometrical. And that makes sense. We want to take advantage of the strength of a vector software, not fight it. If we wanted to make something more organic and detailed, we would use pen and paper. Anyway, that means that most of the complexity comes from working with curves and more complex geometry. That does not necessarily stays to the grid or that's easy to build on a grid. So the next tools and techniques will deal mostly with that, making curves and more complex geometry. And the key to drawing more complex stuff in Inkscape is to use the path effects. Path effects are a feature of Inkscape that allows you to do all sorts of unique things to paths. Think about them as extra tools to use in particular settings. You apply them to a path, and they will modify the way the path looks and behaves, similarly to the controls in the built-in tools, but much more flexible because you can apply them to any path, and they can be turned on and off and even stacked, which will be very important to use later on. To use them, you need to open the Fill and Stroke dialog by going to Path, Path Effects, and then with a path selected, click on this arrow. Here you'll see all the possible path effects the program has to use. If you're creative, you can really potentiate any of your illustrations. I just will be showing you a few of the most essential ones, specifically for isometric illustration. And just as a warning, path effects have always been some of the areas where Inkscape gets the buggiest, and you may need to follow some unusual procedures to avoid some bugs. I'll let you know when something gets problematic as it appears. This is probably the single most important path effect you need to know when working in isometric perspective. It's called Perspective Envelope. You use it to put paths in perspective using 4 control points. You draw the path straight, and then you use this path effect to distort it into perspective. So here I have this pattern. Making something like this in perspective will be really difficult. This pattern is made of multiple paths, so in order to use it, you'll need to group it. Not all path effects work on groups. You'll see that some of them are grayed out, but luckily this one does. Once that you apply the path effect by clicking on Perspective Envelope, you'll see the options of the effect here on the Path Effect dialog. For our purposes, there is no need to touch anything here. Instead, switch to the Node tool and you should see these 4 new controls. Use these to distort the path. And the great thing is that they snap to the grid, so you can easily put them into a plane. And it's in perfect perspective. This is one of my favorite ways to design complex elements because it feels like cheating. You get to work very comfortably flat, and then when you are done, you can make it fit anywhere perfectly. What's better, you can still adjust the shape in perspective itself, though you'll notice that the nodes look like they are in the wrong place. That's because we are editing the original shape. That's not affected by the path effect. Sadly, there is no way to edit into perspective without applying the effect. More on this in a minute. But what you can do is to show the path outline so it's easier to edit. With the node tool, click on this button that says Show Path Outline. It still overlaps with the shape, and that makes it somehow difficult to see, but you can move it out of the way by selecting all of them with the node tool and just dragging it to the side. You cannot use Boolean operations or any other tool, only node manipulation, but at least you have some degree of control after putting it into perspective. Though we'll see how to bypass this limitation later on. This effect has a ton of other possible uses. Let's see a few of them. This is one of the only ways to put text into perspective in Inkscape. Though if you go to the Path Effect dialog while a text object is selected, you'll see that it gives you the option to transform it into a shape, which is the same as going to Path, Object to Path, or clone it. I got no idea why it gives you the option to clone it. Text clones cannot be put into perspective either. If you do transform it to a path, then you can use all the path effects, but you lose the possibility to edit the text. It's not ideal, but it's the only way you can put text into perspective. Drawing curves in perspective is really complicated if you want to be accurate. You can always draw the curvature by hand, but I like to be as accurate as possible. I feel that's more in the spirit of vector illustration. So anything that will include any type of curve, you can just draw it in flat, and when you're done, put it into perspective with the path effect. It's useful to know that you can snap the controls of the effect to the grid as any other point, and then you can extrude it and give it the colors. I will go a bit more in detail on drawing the planes of curved surfaces later on. Here's another reason why the perspective envelope effect is so important. Let's say that you want to make an irregular object, something that does not stay to the grid at all. It's certainly possible to draw it straight in perspective using the grid as a visual guide, but I prefer to draw it and refine the drawing flat. I feel the program just works better this way. When you're done, you apply the path effect and put it into perspective. And repeat the same steps as always, extruding the shape and filling the sides. Another interesting use of the perspective envelope is when you want to put ellipses in exact perspective. Something that will be really hard by squashing it and stretching it with the object tool. Start by making the ellipse with the ellipse tool. Here I'm making a perfect circle. Apply the perspective path effect, and then you put it into perspective. And in this case, because it is a perfect circle, you can easily see how well it fits because the circle touches the center of all four edges of the grid square. Sadly, you cannot change the size using the control options of the built-in shape. The perspective effect will override any changes to the dimensions of the shape, though you can still use the circle modifier because that does not change the dimensions. Making any type of elliptical shape, or any shape that has all corners rounded, poses a bit of a problem. It's impossible to snap that shape to a square from the grid because it doesn't have a corner you can use. You could put it into a square by eye, that's always an option, but if you like to be precise when working with isometric graphics, like you should, then you'll have to use the path effect controls to snap them to the corners. So you'll have to leave the effect applied as much as possible. And here comes another problem when you're extruding a rounded shape. How to connect the corners to make an extrusion. You'll notice how the cusp of the curvature never aligns to the vertical line. Just like before, you can always eyeball the location. If you feel comfortable doing that, great. Though if you later want to use other operations, that little inaccuracy can be punished by the program. If, for example, you decide to create an outline with a dynamic offset operation, it will be really noticeable. Plus, like I said before, I think you have to be as accurate as possible when making this type of art. First of all, you may want to go to the snapping options and enable tangential lines. Most of the time this is a not so useful option to have enabled, but here we want it. Now you can snap to the tangents of objects, which is exactly what you want to fill any rounded side. However, you need an already existing line or object to be able to snap a node to it. The way you fill the size of a rounded extrusion is always by using a single shape. So what we want is to fill the planes by making a rectangle. Grab the pen tool and make a quick rectangle. It doesn't matter the size or shape for as long as it's closed. Now you can snap the four corners to the tangents. Make sure that it actually snaps to the right locations. The little message should say cusp node to path tangent. In the case of cylinders, you may want to give this new shape and the other one the same color, so it looks like one single rounded plane. You can use this method with any other form that has a rounded corner, like this one. And once again, giving it the same color to the two forms below. Okay, but how do you actually round off a corner like I did here? That's a very common thing to do in any isometric illustration. Well, there is a path effect that does that. It works similarly to the way you round off the corners in a built-in rectangle, but better and more flexible. Most of the time you'll want to apply it to a rectangular shape and any other shape with hard corners. But there is an important tip when you apply this effect to a built-in rectangle or any other built-in shape with corners, like the star or polygon. Make sure to transform it to a pure path before applying the effect. Go to Object, Object to Path. You'll see why in a minute. Now add the corners path effect. When you apply this path effect to an object, you're gonna see some extra controllers right next to the corner nodes. By dragging from the two arrows, you will see how much the corner is gonna round off. If you drag it away from the corner, you'll make the radius bigger, and if you draw it closer to the node, you'll make it smaller, eventually completely disabling it when you reach the corner. Notice how it's way more flexible than the built-in rounding options already, since you can go in and set the amount per corner. But we have more interesting settings here in the options. The most important one is this one that says radius. This will give it the roundness to all selected edges. The quantity set in the radius seems to be percentage of roundness, since it doesn't seem to be affected by size. There is this option here that says radius in percentage. That kinda breaks for me, making all the corners uneven for some reason. Just keep that option off. Maybe it's my PC, I'm working on Windows and Windows is way more buggy than Linux for Inkscape. Anyway, here's a very useful option. You can select to what nodes to apply the roundness set in the radius input. Just check this box that says change only selected nodes. This is why if you were working with a built-in rectangle or any other built-in shape, you needed to change it to a path. You can apply this effect to built-in shapes, but you cannot select the individual nodes and take advantage of this option here. Another great thing about this effect is that you can give the corners other types that are not just rounded. In fact, the type of rounding that we've been doing so far has a funny name. It's called chamfer, but we can switch to the other modes with these four buttons over here. Inverse chamfer will do the opposite, creating some reverse rounding off. Very useful. Then you have the fillet and the inverse fillet option. This will just flatten the corners the amount set. Great for angled surfaces. And I have absolutely no idea what's the difference between inverse fillet and normal fillet. They appear to do exactly the same. You can also use the option combined with the change only selected nodes option, so you can have one corner of one type and another of another type. When you're done, you can put these shapes into perspective with the perspective envelope effect. But remember that path effects stack, so you can apply more than one. Meaning that you could first apply the perspective envelope effect, and then you could apply the corners on top. Now any changes you perform on the corners will be able to see it in real time in perspective. As I said before, a path effect does not affect directly the geometry. That's why you can do some things that you can't with other path tools. However, at any moment, you can apply the path effect. That is, give to the path the shape it has with the path effect. Here I have this shape that has a perspective envelope path effect applied. You can see the 4 controls at the corner snapped to the grid. Now if I go to Path, Object to Path, and I switch to the Node tool, you'll notice that the controls are no longer showing. The path effect options here in the path effect dialog are gone, and you can see the individual nodes now match the shape. They are no longer floating here to the side. Now the shape matches the way it's showing. I can go in and grab the nodes and edit it in perspective. I can do Boolean operations and any other type of path operation because it has no longer a path effect applied. This is one of the only ways we have to be able to edit in perspective itself. However, one thing to keep in mind is that we cannot reapply the perspective effect and keep changing the perspective because the effect affects the shape based on the 4 control nodes, and because the shape is in perspective, it just won't work. One last thing, if you perform any Boolean operation with a path that has any path effect applied, this will automatically apply the effect, so that's one limitation that you have to keep in mind. Before ending this lesson, I would like to talk about a couple of features that may have caught your attention. So first, the extrusion extension. In Inkscape, extensions are pieces of code that are written to be added like plugins to the program, similar to scripts in other applications. There's one extension that comes with the program called Extrude Between Two Paths. Don't get your hopes up though, this one is not very good. Just follow the steps of the manual extrusion, duplicate the original shape and move it into position. Put it in the right order. Then you select the 2 shapes and go to Extensions, Generate from Path, Extrude Between Two Paths. Here make sure that this dropdown is set to polygons, and the checkbox doesn't affect the polygons option we chose, so it doesn't matter. Then hit Apply, and you'll see how a new group was created. That more or less worked in filling the sides, but it gave it this weird feel and stroke. However, you'll realize that it's not perfect. It almost works. It almost saves us from the manual process of having to fill the edges, but it falls short. If you change the color to a solid one, you'll see that they are not in the right order, meaning that you will have to go in, enter the group and manually change the stack order, which is a bit of a pain. Another problem, this absolutely does not work with curved surfaces, where it will be the most useful. I guess this extension could be useful in some cases, maybe in super complex shapes with no curves, but it most likely won't. And speaking of alternative extrusion methods, I want to briefly mention a path effect that can confuse you a bit if you see it. It's called the extrude effect, and it's supposed to be able to perform an extrusion automatically through the path effects. The problem is that it doesn't work like this at all. When you apply the effect, the sides will not be created correctly, and neither the overlapping areas, because the planes are created in a very unusual way by connecting the corners. They will be reverted, and the planes will break. And believe me, you don't want to untangle a complicated shape like this. I've read that they are working on a actually useful extrude effect, but for now, this one is completely useless. Forget it exists until a new version of the program comes out. Okay, we are done with the video. That was pretty much everything I know about making isometric graphics in Inkscape. Now it's up to you to see what you can come up with. I recommend you to keep this video as a reference and explore what you've seen here on your own projects. That's the only way things are gonna make sense. Before finishing, I should mention that I have a particular video that you may find interesting. It's part of my step-by-step series, where I make a project in real time and step-by-step, so you can follow along. And the very first video on that series was an isometric island. You'll notice a ton of tools and techniques that I show you here that are present in that video. You should go and check that tutorial if you want. Other than that, I would recommend you to subscribe to the channel. I make Inkscape tutorials every week, and I plan to continue making content on isometric graphics in the future. Also, a like and subscribe will be highly appreciated, And why not write a comment and let me know what you thought about this video, or maybe what you'd like I cover next. That was it for now. I hope you found this video of some use. Have fun drawing!